start off this morning with the obvious facts that are pretty much agreed on by historians. They're called the minimum facts of Christianity. First one being Jesus died by crucifixion. There's not argument about that. That's pretty much historical fact. And it's not just the Bible that supports it. Roman historians report the same thing. The Jews also report the same thing. So there's really not a lot of argument about that. As well, the empty tomb. There's not a lot of argument about the empty tomb. Pretty much historians can gather that the tomb was empty because even the Jews admitted to it. They said that the disciples stole the body, but with that, they're admitting that the tomb is empty.
Right, plus it was a tomb of a known person in Jerusalem. It was in Jerusalem, it was Joseph of Arimathea. So it could be verified whose tomb it was, where the tomb was.
Exactly. So that there's not a whole lot of argument about that either. Post-resurrection appearances. A lot of disciples said they saw Jesus after he was crucified and dead. The idea that could be a swoon theory, we'll get into that as well. But the apostles said they saw him, and a group of over 500 people saw him at one time after the resurrection, alive and well. That's pretty well documented as well. And then one thing that I find really interesting is the birth and growth of Christian faith. After that, it started really started to exist along about 32 AD. That's time frame approximately when the day of Pentecost started. But from 120, that were basically, that's what they talk about, being at the Pentecost with tongues over their heads. And then it exploded, 3,000, 5,000, to the point that by the time Nero was around and burning Rome, the Christians were plentiful enough where he could blame them for doing it. That's 63 or 64 AD. So by that time, Christianity had spread to the point where there was enough people in Rome that the Christians were plentiful. So, what do you got?
Well, I think in addition to that, in the early 200s, Origen wrote his book, Origen Against Celsus, and he notes in there, as you know, Celsus, that Christianity swept through the entire world and it's changed lives, and it's changed lives because people are pointed to Jesus of Nazareth. Mm-hmm. And that these lives were changed, these people say, whose lives were changed because of Jesus, because of God, because of a divine occurrence in my life. Mm-hmm. And that was an undisputed matter as well.
Yeah. And then the post-resurrection experience as well, and something that both Tacitus and a guy by the name of Suetonius, I think that's how you pronounce his name, they had some, especially Tacitus had some very direct evidence of the fact that Jesus was around, killed in Palestine by Pontius Pilate, crucified, and the fact that the faith died out for a very short time and then it exploded. That's him talking, not the Bible talking. But they both say in their description of Jesus that there was something called a mysterious superstition about it. And you can say that might be a number of things, but being the fact that they're hearing this from the Christians with this mysterious superstition that they're talking about, would that be the resurrection? I think there's a pretty good case to be made for that, because they're talking about the Christians and the fact that they believe all this stuff, and they have this mysterious superstition. Now, it doesn't go on to say that that's about the fact that Jesus was resurrected, but I think that's a pretty easy jump to make.
Right. The only early writing that is in any way critical of the miracles of Jesus or the resurrection of Jesus is back to this book, Origen Against Celsus. And we don't have Celsus's book, but Origen quotes from it. And Celsus doesn't deny the miracles. Celsus doesn't deny the resurrection. He chalks it up to sorcery. So it's kind of an implied admission that these things occurred, from a secular philosopher who was very critical of Christianity.
Yeah, but he had to blame, and I think the same thing happens here. We also wanted to run through some of the things that the secular world goes through, because the secular world has to deal with the resurrection, because it's well documented, and there's several things that the Jews could have done to make it so we wouldn't be sitting here talking. The biggest one is all they had to do was produce the body. And they wanted to do that really, really bad because they heard Jesus say that he was going to be physically resurrected. They heard him say that. He said it several different times. So they were determined to bring that body out. And they put guards there, the Romans, I believe the guards were Romans. And they put them there to make sure that nobody took the body and tried to do something with it. Why the disciples would lie about that at the point of death, that's silly as well. But the bottom line is that the tomb was empty. And now secular people have to deal with this. The fact the tomb was empty and that these guys saw, like it says, they saw Jesus resurrected. So here's some of the stuff that I ran through. Maybe you could take one of the stolen body or something, Jay, if you read into that. So there's kind of 4 different ones that they're kind of popular to try to describe and give an excuse. I call it a rescue device for the resurrection. The first one is the theory that it's an unknown tomb. The disciples didn't exactly know where Jesus was buried, and they just went to the wrong one. That is funny, because the bottom line is that they're taking this documentation from the Bible. That's what they're talking about. The Bible describes this, and now they're trying to figure out ways that, we could make this so it doesn't happen the way that it's supposed to happen. But when you take it in the Bible, you also know that who was the people that prepared Jesus' body? It was Joseph and Arimathea, and at least one lady was Mary Magdalene. So they both knew. They prepared his body and put it in the tomb. They knew where it was. There was no mistaking it. And who was the first one that got out to see it on Sunday morning? Mary. And she knew where the tomb was. So I don't think that's a very good excuse, or rescue device, as I call it. You want to try the stolen body, Jay?
Well, first of all, there is not a dispute that the tomb was empty, and as you pointed out earlier, the religious authorities who had a lot of motivation to deny the resurrection admitted that the tomb was empty. The culprits, if you will, or the purported culprits, stayed in Jerusalem. They were still there.
Yeah.
And so it was a known tomb by known people who stayed in the area. So it would have been very easy for the authorities to have found a stolen body. If you talk to homicide investigators, you will uniformly hear that it's very difficult to dispose of a body. And the motivation, and I look to people's motivations. The motivations of the religious establishment were to come up with a body.
Yeah, they wanted to do that desperately.
And nobody, of course, did. And, you've got guards, just right out of the gate, undisputed that Roman guards guarded the tomb, that their lives depended on guarding that tomb successfully. They were unsuccessful, and they should have faced, of course, a capital punishment for this, and apparently did not, because they were bribed, and probably Pontius Pilate was bribed. I don't know, that's not known, but for whatever reason, they got let off the hook. And if anybody was motivated to come up with a body, it was those Roman guards. So how somebody could have gotten in there in the first place is it's not probable. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
The other thing is, it's pointed out, and I don't want to jump the gun on what else you may have, but it's been pointed out that women women have a standing in our culture which is much different than back then. That's the fact. And if the gospel writers were going to make up this story, why did they, all 4 of them, say that it was the women who went to the tomb and discovered that it was empty? That if you were going to make up a fable about this, back then you would have not included women as the prime investigators into this matter.
Their testimony wasn't worth anything. They felt it was
That's correct.
not admissible in court. So if you're going to make up a story, the last thing you would do was have women as your first example. The stolen body too. They're saying that, I don't know whether you guys heard this, but a couple years ago, Ed described who these Roman guards were, what those guys went through to be able to be at the level they're at. They're like Navy SEALs. That's the type of training these guys had. And number one, if they did let this guy get out without killing him, they were going to die. And one of the other guards that were like Navy SEALs are going to kill him. But the other point is these disciples, they wouldn't defend Jesus when he was alive.
Right.
And now the Jews are trying to say, well, they went there with the Navy SEALs guarding the place, overcame the Navy SEALs, took the body and hid it.
Right.
When they wouldn't defend him when he was alive, but they want to defend him when he's dead, which they didn't expect that either. The disciples did not expect Jesus to die. They're expecting him to be a conquering king.
Sure, and they were in hiding. They were afraid.
Mm-hmm. So I find that to be just almost as bad as the swoon theory. There's another one called the swoon hypothesis, saying that Jesus was on the cross, he didn't really die. Instead, he was in a coma. And then when he got to the tomb where they laid him, he revived again and then came out and started walking around. After being almost dead, they put him in the tomb, he revived, and then he was strong enough to move this massive rock out of the way so he could get out. It's just, and the rest of it is that, like Jay said, the Roman guards were very, very good at killing people. When they decided you're going to be dead, you are going to be dead. And there wasn't any intervention for you. So the idea that these guys would have taken the body off the cross and mistakenly thought he wasn't dead yet, they knew how to take pulses then. They knew how to do that. And then Mary Magdalene and Joseph of Arimathea are going to wrap him. They're going to put death clothes around him. They're going to miss it too, that he wasn't really dead. And that theory just, I don't know, to me that
it's also, just as a medical fact that when you are scourged and then crucified, the blood loss alone makes it extremely unlikely that anybody would survive that, particularly when that was their job, just like guarding the tomb. Their job was to make sure the person on the cross was dead.
Yeah.
It was capital punishment in the extreme.
Yeah, Mark.
Well, especially the sword in his side.
That too?
It's like, oh, come on.
Yeah.
Sounds like fake news to me. Oh.
But, the whole thing about these is that the people that are complaining about this, the supposed academics, experts, they're going by what the Bible says. They're saying, okay, we're going to go into the Bible, we're going to see this because there's an awful lot of evidence this really happened. They're going in the Bible, and now they're trying to get, again, a rescue device that Jesus didn't rise from the dead. And everybody observed it. So now they're coming up with these crazy theories that, it seems to me like all you really have to do is just look at the situation. And we wouldn't be sitting here right now if the Romans or the Jews could have produced the body. Because Jesus would have lied about being physically resurrected. But, of course, they couldn't do it. That's to me, that's the biggest one of all, is the fact that they couldn't produce the body, and they wanted to do that desperately, especially the Jews. They hated the fact that Jesus said he was going to resurrect and that he was Messiah and all the rest of the stuff because, maybe he didn't pick 12 of the Pharisees to be his disciples instead of these hayseeds from Galilee. We talked about that on Thursday.
Yeah, that's a good point. They knew in advance that Jesus claimed he was going to resurrect.
Physically.
Not
just spiritually, but physically resurrect.
Right.
Yeah. And then the last
other things involved in that is that where the disciples first started preaching Jesus as being resurrected was in Jerusalem. Anywhere that you could go and say, no, it's over here, you can see that it's still closed up, or this is that, it would be Jerusalem. So the fact that they started preaching his resurrection in Jerusalem is also evidence that he was risen, because nobody could say, no, that's not right.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, the place to start that, if you're gonna start a rumor or start a lie, would be to go to Tiberias or somewhere up north where they couldn't check it out.
And the Jewish authorities would have written more about it than, other than the fact that just the disciples stole the body.
Yeah,
They would have written more about it than that.
yes.
And that's the only mention. The last one is the hallucination theory. The theory suggests that the disciples were so overwhelmed with grief that they hallucinated seeing and hearing Jesus after his death.
Pretty big
It's
hallucination.
almost comical. That one.
Well, we know that individuals have hallucinations, but group hallucinations, there's really no documented evidence of that.
No.
That you are going to get 12 people in a group to hallucinate simultaneously, or let alone, the 500
Yeah.
that saw him. And that it was people in different periods of time. This occurred over a period of time. And in the book of Acts, it says that Jesus taught for 40 days
Yeah.
during this resurrected phase before the ascension.
Of course, he was seen by all his apostles, except Thomas, and then Thomas said, if I could see him and touch his wounds and the side where he was stabbed, then I'll believe.
Yeah.
But he didn't need that, he just needed to see it, and he bowed down to Jesus.
Yep.
Right.
So yeah, the ideas behind it, I find the alternatives to be much more fanciful than the actual document that they talk about. Now, is it normal for someone to rise from the dead? No, it's not. But you have to take into account who it was that's doing it. It's the one who created life in the first place.
Well, and this gets back to Genesis 1. If you acknowledge, which is logical, that there had to be a supernatural cause to start the beginning of the universe, then how far-fetched is it that God could resurrect a man?
Which Jesus did so, and the Jews watched it, that Lazarus. So the ones that went there, some of them actually came to faith, right? Some of the priests came to faith
Yes.
at that point because they saw this. They all knew Lazarus was dead, was in the tomb for 4 days, came walking out wrapped up. And that had to be just a stunner. And they went back and they became Christians. I think that's where Gamaliel, or the high priest, also gave the prophecy that one man was going to die for the nation,
Right.
instead of the nation dying.
No, their reaction, not denying it, their reaction is, let's kill Lazarus and Jesus.
Yeah.
Let's destroy the evidence. And again, there's an awful lot going on here for there not to be a Jewish writing in existence denying all of this. They were back to motivations. They had all the motivation in the world to come up with whatever evidence existed to refute the Lazarus resurrection, Jesus's resurrection, and there's just this stunning silence about it.
Yeah. Yes, that's a good way to put it. A stunning silence that there is not a thing written, not only at that time, but for a little short of 1800 years, there was nothing at all written about any of it, that it wasn't true.